before presenting Sam and going further, I want to let you know, to remind you that we have 6 talks over 14 days from speakers like Sam Julien, Alice Pittle, Annie, Colby, Samson, and Sultan. So don't miss any of these. Okay, going further, let's introduce Sam, which is our today's speaker. Sam is managing the developer relations team at Auth0, and he's also an instructor on 2 platforms, Thinkster and Egghead. And he also wrote an excellent book, and the book is called Getting Started in Developer Relations. I read it, and it's amazing. If you are interested in get to know this field, I highly recommend it. And today he's going to talk about the counterintuitive secret to shipping better articles and faster. But without further ado, I want to welcome Sam on stage and let him do the speaking. Welcome, Sam.
Hey, thank you. Good to be here. I'm excited. Cool. So let's just get started. Let me share my screen here. Every platform is slightly different. Screen share. Oh no. I'm sorry. I have to exit and re-enter in order to enable screen sharing on here. I'll be right back. I apologize. I updated my OS recently and it messed up my security settings. Be right back.
Meanwhile, are you excited to be here? Let us know in the comments.
Okay, let's try this again.
Welcome back.
Apple has really gone overboard with their security settings. All right, screen share. All right, let's minimize that. All right, really happy to be here, everybody. So this talk is called The Counterintuitive Secret to Shipping Better Articles Faster. Spoilers, it's not work harder. So I've been doing technical content to some degree for about 5 years now. And this has happened to me, and I've noticed it's a pattern with a lot of people. I call it the ultimate guide trap. And what happens is, at some point along the way, you get super motivated to start blogging. You come to something like this. I know I got inspired at different points in time to get started blogging. So your motivation is super high. And so immediately you take to the keyboard and you just start writing, and you try to build the ultimate guide to whatever it is that you're working on. Maybe the ultimate guide to TypeScript or the ultimate guide to React or something like that. You want to build this big, complicated article. And there's, one of 2 outcomes will happen. Either you'll ship this ultimate guide, or you'll get so overwhelmed by the process that you abandon it. But in either case, this big effort of trying to write when your motivation's super high and cranking out this big, complex, huge article leads to some exhaustion. And because you've just made this big effort and shipped this huge thing, and now you're totally exhausted. And whether or not the article is successful, sometimes you launch an article like that and it gets a lot of action and you get a lot of great feedback on it. Sometimes you ship an article like that and nobody reads it, and maybe that's a little bit discouraging. But in either case, what usually happens is that it took you so much work and energy to ship that giant article that then if I come back to your blog in a few years, I'm not going to see much else, because it took so much work to get that first article out the door that then maybe you sporadically write a little bit once a year or something, but it's really hard to build consistent content process. And this happened to me probably my first couple of years. I went through this cycle of just shipping something big and then disappearing for a while. So the question that we're going to talk about in this talk is how can I consistently create useful, practical content without getting burned out? So I'm Sam Julien. I manage the developer relations team at Auth0. We have DevRel people all over the world, and we're an identity as a service platform. So if you are adding auth to your application, you need like login and logout and user management. You just drop in one of our SDKs and set up a little bit of configuration, and you're good to go. You don't have to write it all yourself. Like Catalin mentioned, I've written Getting Started in Developer Relations. I also have another book called Guide to Tiny Experiments, which is a framework for finishing what you start. And then I send a weekly newsletter called Developer Micro Skills, where each week I send a practical, actionable way to improve as a developer or developer advocate. I wanted to mention, since this is the right audience, Auth0 has two programs that you might be interested in. One is called the Ambassador Program, which is a way that we teach developer relations by way of Auth0, where we give you swag and travel support and things like that as you write content or speak about Auth0. And then we also have an official guest authors program called the Apollo Program. This is for writing on the Auth0 blog. It's a huge blog that gets tons of traffic. Both of these programs do have application processes, but I highly recommend you check them out and use them to level up your career. Okay, so the top takeaways that we're going to cover in this talk. We're going to talk about the secret to building any new skill, not just writing. We're going to talk about the value of a systematic approach to content. And we're going to talk about practical tips on building your content system. Now, the title of this talk was Shipping Articles. This really could apply to any type of content if you're doing video or streaming or anything like that. There's sort of a set of skills that come along with that process. So the secret that I mentioned is consistent small wins. Consistent small wins are the secret to building any new skill. What happens when we get started with creating content as developers, we usually go through this cycle where at first it's really overwhelming to know what to create. It feels like there's any number of topics that you could write about or make videos about. It feels like people have already done the same thing. And then as you get going, then you find that you have this you have the opposite problem where you have this never-ending backlog of things that you want to work on. So you have this endless list of topic ideas, and you feel like you're never actually crossing things off the list. You might have 10 or 15 unpublished drafts that are just sort of waiting around that you're never quite finishing. And then this leads to this never-ending cycle of sort of going through this overwhelming process and having all the edited drafts, and then finally getting around to shipping something. And we got into creating content mostly for fun, right? And it turns out that fun can be very exhausting once you run up against the boundaries of learning a new skill. And so the first piece of advice here is to try not to think of content or any other skill that you're building as a dictionary to memorize. I think that's what really trips people up, is they start to write, they run into a problem where it gets really difficult or it's hard to stay consistent. And they're thinking of it in terms of they've got to like memorize a bunch of steps or figure out a bunch of new problems. And I'd recommend that you instead try to think like an explorer. Think like you're exploring a map rather than trying to memorize a dictionary or cross things off of a checklist. And if you think about a map like in a video game, you don't ever see the whole map all at once. And you don't really see the whole story all at once, right? You go around and you explore different areas, and there's different bosses that you have to fight to get to new levels. And that's a way to think of this content process that you're going through as you attend something like this boot camp. You're learning new territory as you grow in your career and as you write and create content. But there's a difference between wandering versus exploring. I use the word wandering very specifically because wandering is more of an aimless thing where you sort of wander around and get lost and that kind of thing. Humans are surprisingly bad at navigating by gut feel. A couple of years ago, I took a bunch of wilderness classes and hiking and camping classes and things like that. And one of the classes I took was on navigation with a compass and a map. And we did this exercise where we had to try to go in a straight line without a compass and a map in the woods. And it was kind of embarrassing how terrible we all were at going in a straight line, because humans have this hardwired, evolved sense of pattern matching where we're trying to see patterns in bushes and trees and things like that. And so we're actually not very good at tracking our own progress just by gut feel. We need that objective reality. And one reason is that we're sort of programmed to seek comfort and familiarity. I mentioned the pattern matching. This is an evolutionary trait that we've developed. But comfort is actually the enemy of growth. Think about when you've maybe driven 1,000,000 times and you get in your car to go to work and you drift off in your mind, and then all of a sudden you're at work or you're back home or something and you've completely checked out. This is sort of an example of this, because our brains really like this homeostasis. We like this equilibrium where we don't have to think or we don't have to grow. But this prevents us from actually evolving and growing ourselves. Now, I have to make a caveat here, because I don't ever want you to interpret me saying that comfort is the enemy of growth as some piece of advice to just like hustle all day and all night. Context is really important here. I'm talking about like intellectual discomfort for the sake of growth, not like, well, you just need to find a way, work more hours, be miserable. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I am saying is that I want you to be as effective as you can be in whatever amount of time you have to work on your content process. So how do we get predictable and repeatable growth, whether we're working on writing or something else? What causes us to grow? Well, it turns out there's actually a little bit of a formula for growth in any area that you're trying to work on. And the formula is that we grow by doing challenging things quickly and then getting feedback. So when I talk about doing challenging things quickly, there's actually a method to this. And what I want you to think about here is think about when you need to lift a heavy weight or perform in a musical performance, or anything where you have to perform and there's high stakes involved, is an example of how this causes you to grow. When you have to give your best effort and there's actual consequences to not doing that, you don't have time to overthink, and that's what causes you to grow. So there's some things we can do to recreate this in situations that aren't like lifting a heavy weight or performing on stage or something like that. So you can recreate this by doing things that are production focused, so where there's a specific deliverable, like creating an article or a video or a website or something like that, where there's something that's trackable. So you know whether an article is shipped or not, you know whether a website has been shipped or not. And this is better than just something vague like get better at writing or get better at video production. And we also want something that's measurable, right? Because we're able to track things, we're also able to measure them. So we can measure our impact with things like articles and videos. And then the second half of that is doing something and being able to get feedback on it. Once we have things that are shipped in the real world that we can know whether or not they're successful, we can also get feedback on them. And there's a few different ways you can get feedback. One is just, does the thing work, which we use all the time with code. Another is learning in groups, where you could do like cohort learning. And then there's learning in public. And it turns out that writing and creating content is perfect for learning in public. So we've learned how we can actually grow in a skill like writing by doing challenging things quickly and then getting feedback through learning in public. And now we want to talk about actually building a content system. And the key word here is system. I mentioned earlier the dilemma of just making this big effort and then getting exhausted and not wanting to do it again. And that's because creating content is hard. It sounds really like nice when and ideal when it's all in your head and you have this dream of writing a bunch of articles or making a bunch of videos. And then as you get through it and as you get over that first bit of motivation, it starts to get more and more challenging. But I want to encourage you with the words of Jake the dog from Adventure Time, in that sucking at something is actually the first step towards being sort of good at something. So you're on the right path. There's a chart called the Gartner Hype Cycle. And this actually doesn't have anything to do with creating content, but it works nonetheless. This is about technology adoption. And this is a very common pattern where you get you start at the peak of inflated expectations. And then as you keep going, as you're trying to build a new skill, you fall into the trough of disillusionment. I think we've all probably been there with something or another, maybe when you were learning to code or doing something else like that. And what we want is to be able to get you up this slope of enlightenment onto the plateau of productivity. So how do we do that? That's what the rest of this talk is all about, is getting up to the plateau of productivity. So there's a great book called Atomic Habits. It's super popular, but it's actually not overrated. It's really, really good. And James Clear says, you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And that is, I found that to be very true. And so I try to build systems when my motivation is not there for me. Kind of silly example of this is when I first moved to Portland in 2014, I barely knew anybody. And I wanted to just come home from work and pass out or maybe play some video games or something and not go anywhere or do anything. But I really didn't want to be that guy. I wanted to get out and explore the new city I was in and try to make friends and do all that. So I kind of built this system where I would pick a part of town and find something that I had to do there. And I would figure out the public transportation to get up to that part of town and then use that as a way to explore that area. And that turned out to be a really good systematic way to explore the city. And one of the places I found was this picture is a synthesizer store called Control Voltage that's in North Portland. And I discovered it because I was going and exploring that part of the city because I just made myself get out of the house, even when I wasn't motivated, just by building a little system like that. So you want to do the same thing for your content, whether you're writing or creating videos or things like that. You want to build a small but complete system. And let's look at what that actually looks like. The pieces of a content system are going to be, first you're going to be drafting, then you're going to be creating, then you're going to publish something, then you're going to need to promote it, and then you're going to need to garden it or maintain it. So when you're drafting, you're gathering notes, you're creating an outline, you're starting a first draft. And then when you create, this is when you're writing and recording, adding images, adding in some code samples. And then the publishing process, you publish it on your site, add in social images, and then cross-post to other places using canonical links. And then promotion, you can make Twitter threads, you can post in forums or chat groups, you can give talks based on articles or other writing that you've done. This talk is in fact exactly that. And then gardening. So gardening is just another way to talk about maintaining. So updating content over time, doing maintenance or corrections, cross-linking your articles between the two. And what I found over the years of doing content is that it's much better to go slow and steady, taking an article through this whole process, rather than just haphazardly creating something once in a blue moon. Now, this might seem really overwhelming when you actually break it down like this and realize how many parts there are to creating content. And I totally understand that. And so I'm going to give you some advice on creating your own content system over time. So like I said, it's better to build a small but complete system little by little than sort of haphazardly trying to do things. I find it easier to divide this process in half and think about sort of the drafting, creating, and publishing process, and then everything that happens as you publish it and after you publish it. So I call this part the creation phase, and let's talk a little bit about that. So first I want to give you a few tools that you can use to help as you go through this creation phase of your process. You're going to need a scratch pad, a task manager, and a knowledge system. And I should mention, I mean, these are the things that work for me. Of course, your implementation is going to look a little bit different, but this will give you a good starting point. So as we talk about these tools, though, I want you to think about this. What I was talking about before of haphazardly creating these big, heavy articles is called a heavy lift. And there's another way of creating content called the slow burn. And this is a term I got from someone named Tiago Forte, who's really big in the knowledge management space. But the idea is that instead of having to do these big efforts all at once, you slowly add notes and compile things together in your drafts so that you can let an article evolve over time. And I found this to be really useful until I'm ready to actually publish something. So there's some tools I use for this. The first is a scratch pad. This is a way for me to eliminate the distraction of figuring out where to jot something down. So let's say I'm in the middle of one thing and I have an idea or a thought about a topic that I'm writing about or creating content on. I don't want to necessarily stop everything I'm doing and go to the exact draft in my drafts part of my blog or something and like break all of my context and start completely getting distracted. So instead, I just use a little app called Drafts that I can just pop up a new draft and write things down really quickly and immediately get back to what I'm doing. So this is a really useful thing because you don't always have ideas at the exact time that you're working on something. So you can use a lot of different things for this, like Notepad or Google Docs or Google Keep or something like that. What you're looking for is speed and ease of use, and then the ability to get that writing out and export to other things. That's one of the reasons I love Drafts, is that I can export it using, I can export it to like anything under the sun, Google Docs or a file or anything else. The next thing you'll need is some sort of knowledge base. You're going to want some sort of notebook, digital notebook, to put your articles together. And this way you can slow burn your drafts and link all of your ideas together. The really revolutionary thing about this concept of knowledge base or digital or second brain or things like that you might hear is that you have the ability to link your ideas together. You can do these backlinks where you can reference ideas or notes back to each other. So I currently use an app called Obsidian. I'm obsessed with it. It's really revolutionized the way that I write and think. You can also use something like Evernote or Roam or Notion. But the big important thing here is the ability to cross-link or put things in collections. Some of these apps also have the ability to add in images or embed YouTube videos or things like that. So those are always also really useful. And then the last tool you're going to need is a task manager. And this is so that you can determine the next action and the context for a project and get something out the door. So I use all the time when it's time to actually publish something. I'll make a checklist of all the different things I need to do. I use OmniFocus for this. So I've really enjoyed using that for many years, but you can also use things like Things or Google Keep. These come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and it's important to find one that works with your brain. People think different ways about these things. But the most important thing is you want to be able to add tags or context to things. Okay, and so then 3 tips on this side of the content process. The first one is just in the beginning, move quickly to define your process. Now that might sound counterintuitive because I just said to build a small but complete system and go slowly. So you're going slowly in sort of the meta of walking through a process, but you want to publish articles quickly. Do short, small things quickly so that you can kind of hammer this out without having to do big efforts. And remember that we grow by doing challenging things quickly and get feedback. The learning is actually in the speed of action. So what you want to do is do these tiny experiments where you run small articles through your whole process. And that way you can kind of find the flaws in the process as you go. Another tip would be to start with what you know. This is a mistake a lot of people make when they're first getting started with writing, where they it's a totally valid thing to use writing or making content as a way to learn something. That's one of the things you can do. But if you're trying to practice the skill of writing and publishing and getting more consistent with your writing, oftentimes that can slow you down because you're simultaneously trying to learn a new topic as you learn a new skill. So one thing that can really help with that is to just isolate the skill of learning to ship. So just write content that's based on something you already know. And not only will this help you as you're trying to learn how to write and ship and get more consistent, it'll also help other people because you're writing something that you actually know about and you're helping probably somebody who's more of a beginner than you are. And there's always room to help more beginners learn something that you already know. So it might not seem as exciting to write, maybe the basics of whatever language you're working on or a project that you already know about. But a lot of sometimes your best content can come from that. An example for me is that last year I was trying to practice getting more consistent with videos. And I started making this series on Egghead called Angular Basics because I knew it was something that I knew backwards and forwards. And I just wanted to get better at the practice of shipping everything. So I ended up shipping something like 24 lessons of Angular Basics on Egghead. And surprisingly, it's like been one of the most popular things I've done. And I think it's just because there's just not a lot of beginner content out there. And it was definitely a win-win. If you're totally stuck on what to write about, if you're like, I just don't understand what you're even talking about, let me give you a format that works super well for this. I call it the Today I Learned format. And basically, it's just really simple. Write a couple of sentences in the beginning describing a problem that you had during the work week. Maybe you ran into a bug or something. And then write a few sentences about the solution and how you got there. So I had a bug doing date time formatting. And then I found this external library that helped me format it. And then write the final finished code that somebody can copy and paste. And then write a couple of sentences just recapping the problem and solution with a link to your Twitter or a shout out to your newsletter or something like this. This sounds really simple, but it's very, very useful. And if you do this, if you were to do this like once a week or twice a week, you have at least 100 articles by the end of the year. And they would actually be really useful. You'd be able to track all of your progress that you've made throughout a year just by writing down a little bit every day or a little bit once a week of something that you've learned at work or as you've been hacking to get things. And then the last tip for the content creation process is just don't over-engineer too quickly. I think as developers, we really want to jump into a complex system as fast as we can, but automating something too quickly is going to be a problem. So remember that it's not a failure, it's a test. If you run into problems with your process, just learn from it, get some new data from it, and adjust accordingly. So that's the first half of this process. Then the second half, the kind of promotion post-publication phase. So just a couple of tips there for you as you're building this out. Remember that every piece of content that you create has a price tag. That price tag is promotion and maintenance. This is something when I first joined Auth0, I was on the content team, which runs the blog. And it's interesting to go over from being a hobby writer to actually doing it full time, because you realize that every article you write, you have to remember that you have to keep it up to date. You have to find ways of promoting it on social media. And that has a cost to it, and a very real cost of hours of time. And so it's something to keep in mind that as you write, you want to remember to make time for that. The second tip is to provide direct value on each platform when you're promoting things. It's easy to just sort of like drive by a user group and dump a link and move on. And nobody likes that. Nobody likes the person who just kind of constantly dumps their links into platforms. As you go to a platform like Twitter, or if you're cross-posting to places, remember to think about what people are looking for. Like, why are they at that website? What's their frame of mind? Are they looking to get to know you as a person? Are they just trying to get their problem solved? And then how can you provide value on the spot? So instead of just dumping a link to an article you've written, you might actually write out a part of the article to actually answer somebody's question, and then say, like, if you want to learn more, I wrote this article over here. The best person in the world at this is a guy named Harry Dry. He runs a website called Marketing Examples. If you take nothing away from this talk, just go to marketingexamples.com and read everything that Harry Dry has ever done. Because what he does is he's an absolute master at providing value on every platform. If you follow him on Twitter or Instagram or YouTube or Reddit or Indie Hackers or anywhere else, he formats content for the platform he's on, and it's absolutely genius. And he also has an article, you can see a link right there, how I promote my content. Great person to learn from on this. And lastly, you've got to be patient. These things take a long time. Sometimes you might get a spike in popularity, which is fantastic, but just sort of the art of writing consistently and publishing consistently takes some time. I have kind of a funny story about this. One of my best friends growing up is a sound designer in Los Angeles, and he reorchestrates video game soundtracks as a side gig. And a few years ago, he released this album, which was a reorchestration of a Zelda game called Majora's Mask. And it was a huge success. It was on the front page of Bandcamp. Tens of thousands of people started following him. It was just like a huge deal. It was really fun to watch. But I remember he did an AMA on Reddit, and it was really funny because people kept referring to him as this overnight sensation. And what they didn't realize is that he and I, when we were in high school, would be messing around with keyboards and music software that we may or may not have acquired by buying it. And we were like tinkering around with this stuff. He had been working on composing and sound design and things like that for a decade before he got all this fame and success from this album that he wrote. And that was a really great object lesson for me of just sort of like what appears to be an overnight success really takes a lot of time and work to build. Okay, I've hit you with a lot of things here. So let's do a quick recap of everything. So our first subject was the need for consistency. And I talked about the value of thinking like an explorer instead of just trying to memorize things when you're trying to learn something. We talked about how systems are greater than motivation, because when your motivation is low, you still have a process in place that you can get things done. And then we talked about the formula for growth being action plus speed plus feedback. And then we looked at a few tools. I talked about the scratch pad, which is really useful to not have to break your flow during the day. We talked about a knowledge base that you could link all of your thoughts together. And we talked about a task manager for when you're actually shipping your content. I gave you some tips for the creation phase. What you want to do is move fast and just reduce the scope of your articles so that you can move quickly. I gave you the Today I Learned format as a great way to practice that. You should start with what you know. It is a great thing to use writing and creating content to learn a new thing. That's a wonderful, I do it all the time. But as you're trying to build the skill of writing and shipping, start with something that you're already really familiar with. Just pick a topic that you already know, like the basics of a language that you're working in or a framework that you're working in, and just try to write consistent content about it. And lastly, don't over-engineer too quickly in here. It's tempting to add a bunch of automations or build a whole custom app for your process and all of that. And that's going to trip you up if you do it too quickly. And then finally, talked about the post-publication phase. All content has a price tag of growth, promotion, maintenance, that kind of thing. Make sure when you're promoting to provide direct value on the platform that you're on. I'll give you the example of marketingexamples.com. And finally, be patient. This stuff takes time, and consistency takes time to build. So Hashnode asked every speaker to give a challenge. So my challenge for you is to write one of these Today I Learned articles and take it through your whole system from drafting all the way through publication, and then promoting it somewhere and maintaining it and that kind of thing. So all you need to do to actually complete the challenge is just write the Today I Learned article and share it with them on Hashnode. And then I suggest doing what's called a tiny experiment, where you tell yourself that you're going to commit to writing 4 of these articles in 4 weeks, once a week, so that you can start to build this habit. And I talk about that more in my book, Guide to Tiny Experiments. So that's everything. I have I've got slides and a whole boatload of resources, articles and stuff that I've written, as well as articles and courses and all of that other people have done. And it's just at samj.im/shipping-talk. And that's it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam, for the talk. It was awesome. I really enjoyed it. I'm a big fan of your content and of yourself, so it was really awesome. And now we might have some questions for you.
Yeah, really great talk, Sam. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was completely insightful. And for our audience, Sam's talk was really insightful. It wasn't really tough for you to, pick up gems from it. So we really encourage you to share your learnings on Twitter and LinkedIn. We have a giveaway for you, so you can read more about it in the chat section. Sam, now we will be taking questions. Are you ready for them?
Sure, yeah. Let's see.
Yeah. So anyone, if you have put your questions in the chat section, I request you to put it in the question section so that we can like simply go through them. Okay. So the first question for you, Sam, is related to your map metaphor. How do you decide when to enter a room and expend a content or leave the room for another article? How do you know readers will follow your path?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I've evolved on this over time. I think my default now is to, I feel like less is more now, where it's better to have something small but complete, kind of a complete thought on something, and then you can always expand it later. But if you try to put too much in one article, then it might overwhelm people and they leave. So what I tend to do is I tend to try to put kind of my best effort for a complete thought in an article or a video, and then if I get feedback like that, you know, if I start getting questions about a particular facet of the article, I'll just go back and I'll add to it later, or I'll make another article and link back to it or something like that. So my tendency is to kind of err to the side of being simple. But I guess I should also say that I do try to be I try to thoroughly explain the topic that I'm talking about, right? So like if I am talking about how to write a CFP for a conference or something, I will be really detailed in how I talk about, you know, creating the CFP and all of that stuff. But maybe I won't talk about finding conferences or something like that, because that's sort of a different rabbit hole to go down. So that's sort of an example of that.
Yeah, I really liked your point about the feedback. So I have also encountered it. Like if you simply write in the end of your articles that if the readers want explanation for anything, they can simply ask for it. Okay. Catalin, are you there? Okay. Till Catalin joins back. Yeah. You are not audible.
I saw one in there, a question in there about gardened articles not being revisited and cross-posting them, asking about promoting the update again. There's two things I recommend there. One is, yes, definitely you need to promote your articles regularly. I think people think about they don't want to be overly self-promoting, but you have to remember that on sites like Twitter, there's the algorithm is going to prevent most people from seeing what you post most of the time. So just going back and re-promoting something from months ago is a totally good thing to do. The other thing that you want to do as you're gardening your articles is you want to update them for SEO. So make sure you go back and like update the headers to be more searchable. Optimize the articles as you're updating them, because the other big mistake I think people make is they assume that something like Twitter is the only place to get traffic, when in fact it's really not even a good place to get traffic. It gets some traffic, especially if you're someone like Catalin with 60,000 followers. But if you're not, actually inbound traffic from search is going to be the best bet. Like I have this one article that's just about adding route to an Angular app that for some reason, just because of the way I've optimized the post, gets like thousands of views a month. And I don't know if I've ever posted it on Twitter. So that's a good thing to remember, as to optimize as you're doing those gardening. Yes, cross promote them, but also update some of the SEO information for inbound traffic.
Coming back to what he said, I think it's better to optimize your articles for search engines and using proper SEO than Twitter, because more traffic comes from search engines than Twitter. And even though I have a big following, I don't have that much traffic from Twitter. So Okay, going to the next question. Somebody asks how we get the slides afterwards.
Yeah, so that was just, I dropped a link in there, samj.im/shipping-talk. So I've got an article there that's got the link to the slides and then a whole bunch of resources like my articles and books and a bunch of other places.
Nice, thank you. We will post that in the Discord channel in Bootcamp, so you'll have the link. And the next question, how to reach more people?
Yeah, so I think probably the SEO stuff is probably the best place to start with that. I was actually just telling Faisal yesterday, like one of the things I really appreciate about Hashnode, the reason that I am a fan of it, is because it provides a bunch of those tools for you right out of the box. So doing things like focusing on headers, adding metadata, and most importantly, probably is just when you're writing something new, think about if it's something that people are going to search for, right? So like adding routing to React is going to be something people are going to search for, right? Whereas like some esoteric piece of knowledge that might be really valuable, it might be a good reference article for people. But if your goal is to bring in traffic and build an audience, you want to think about those keywords that people will be looking for. And you can use sites like Hashnode to your advantage because you can actually go and look at the kinds of things that are popular. And at one point, Hashnode, you still have you had this like one part of the site that was like requests for articles. Does that still exist? It was like an upvoting system for like what kinds of content people want to see. I remember sharing that with the Author ambassadors. It was basically just like, here you go. Here's like a whole list of articles you can write. But yeah, that's another good one.
Okay, thank you for your answer.
Yeah, we can go to our next one. So somebody asked related to your system of consistency. Do you kind of give yourself micro rewards to finish them? So yeah, this is something interesting. And how do you avoid procrastination?
Yeah. So this is sort of why I wrote my last book. But what I try to do is I found that I can't stay focused on something for more than a couple of days at a time. So I have to break things down into, I basically give myself like 72 hours to finish anything, whether that's for my day job or for my like writing or content or something like that. So I try to, for example, I pin a bunch of work on Monday through Wednesday. I probably do a week's worth of work just on Monday through Wednesday, just so I can like get things done. And as far as micro rewards, this is one of those things where I don't practice what I would definitely tell you to give yourself micro rewards. Even I actually like just sent out an issue of my newsletter about this, about like celebrating your wins. It's actually really important to celebrate your wins, both with your boss and just for yourself. It like reinforces psychologically whatever habit you're trying to build. It could be anything. I mean, you could reward yourself with a piece of chocolate or just like dancing around your room or telling your boss or something like that. But it's definitely really important. I am really trying to get better at this. I'm very hard on myself, so I don't often reward myself. And I'm trying to get better at that because it is important. But deadlines, avoiding procrastination, I would say, I have an article called "How to Finish What You Start," and I linked to it on the page that all the or wait, no, I don't. I will link to it. I'll drop a link in the chat. But there's sort of a trick you can use of scoping projects to where you can you want to scope things down to where you can get things done quickly and repeatedly. And that's the best way to avoid procrastination. Because most of the time procrastination comes from not being completely clear what the next step is and not being completely clear like how to finish something. So if you can eliminate those two barriers, then you're going to get a lot more done.
Amazing, thank you. So we have another question. How can we start blogging on Auth0?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked. There's we just relaunched the guest author program. It's now called the Apollo program to kind of line up more with the ambassadors. And it is I don't run this program because it's run by the content team. But I just posted an article there in the chat. There's an application process. They're looking for specific types of content, like different languages and tech stacks and things like that. So there's a little application that you fill out about kind of what subject area you're interested in and some examples of articles and things like that. It's definitely it's a more rigorous program to get in now just because it has been so popular, but I definitely recommend applying for it. We pay for articles, and too. That's another thing I should mention is there are a lot of places out there that pay for articles, and it's definitely worth getting into. There's a repo, if I can lay my hands on it, that a friend of mine put together that has, here it is, a whole list of paid writing programs. I'm just going to paste that in there. My friend Daniel, who is a developer advocate for Strappy, put this together.
Okay, thank you. I really enjoy this. I get to learn a lot, especially that I'm new in this area. So this is another interesting question, which I'm curious as well. I think I lost it. I think it was about what's the word count you suggest for an article, like 500, 1,000. Yeah, it's here. Do you have some recommendations about the length of any article? Maybe 200, 300, 500, combined images, screenshots, code. I hope the
yeah, and I saw another question that was pretty similar to that. So there's a lot of debate about whether short articles or long articles are better, and they have their pros and cons. But I will say that there is a threshold for SEO. I want to say it's like 700 or 1,000 words or something, where if it's too short, if there's not enough content on the page, then it won't perform as well. So I definitely noticed a difference. Like if I just have, there were a couple of articles that I just barely were even articles. I just sort of like threw up some text and a video, and those weren't performing at all until I actually like fleshed out the writing and added some better headers and things like that. So in the beginning if you're just trying to build the habit, I wouldn't stress about the word count or anything like that. I would just write and ship, and you can always update them later. But I would say that you probably want to at least do like 500 to 700 words just so that they'll index a little bit better. I tend to write, I've noticed my articles tend to be 12 to 1,500 words for like a medium topic, and maybe closer to like 2,000 or 3,000 words for like a big long topic.
Nice. This was really helpful for myself as well as a blogger.
Yeah, the answers are so good. Like we can keep on rolling this session for 2 hours, but we really can't. So I'm gonna go ahead and merge a few questions that I read, so that we have a consolidated question for that. So one question that major of the people are asking is, how do you judge that you are competent enough to write about a particular topic? So if somebody is a very complete beginner, how do they know they are competent enough to write about it? And once they write about it, what are the ways to measure impact of that article in terms of tools, as well as in terms of the career opportunities they are getting, monetization, and all sorts of impact?
Sure. So as far as the competency thing, this is a thing in DevRel you have to do a lot because you often have to create content quickly on a subject. So what I do a couple of things. The first thing I try to do is I come from an academic background, and so I try hard to research as much as I can before I put something out there in the form of a talk or an article, where I kind of get the lay of the land of the subject, and I figure out kind of who are the key people in this subject area, and then research the area, find a bunch of different references. Let me make this more concrete. I had to do this last January. I had to build a talk on auth in GraphQL. I was speaking at GraphQL Asia in Bangalore. And so in December and January, I had to build this talk on authentication and authorization in GraphQL, which I wasn't an expert at. And so I first figured out some different key players in that area, figured out what the key libraries were in that area, read a bunch of articles, wrote a bunch of stuff. And then what I did was, once I had built a first version of the talk, I ran it by two people. I ran it by one person, Ryan Chanke, who's a good friend of mine, who is an expert at auth and GraphQL. He now works for, he used to work for Auth0. And then another friend of mine named Kim, who was also at the time working for Auth0. So I ran it by a GraphQL expert and an identity expert to make sure that, what I was saying was legit. Now, of course, you don't have that for every single thing you do, but that's a good way. If you're really concerned about publishing something wrong, I would say do some research and then ask for feedback from people. Now, I will say, I think people get too hung up on this too quickly. Usually if you're concerned about being competent, then you're probably the kind of person who's going to research it enough to be not completely wrong on something. So there's definitely a balance in, doing your best and asking for feedback. And I think always posting it out there as the fact that you're willing to be wrong, and you can always update things based on new information. But those are kind of my go-tos for when I'm doing something that I'm not an expert on. Oh, and then the second half of that was measuring your impact, right? So there's a few different levels of this. One would be just traffic. So this would be something you could get through some sort of analytics tool like Google Analytics or Fathom, or Hashnode provides some basic traffic stats and things like that. So that's one area. You can also measure this through, if you have a newsletter sign up, you can measure signups from a particular article. Same with if you have a product that you're selling or something like that. Another part of SEO is backlinks. So the number of people that are referring back to an article you wrote by linking to their site. So if you write a great article on something, and then somebody refers to it on their site, that's called a backlink. So that's another great way to measure. Of course, there's social media shares. Also just sort of qualitative feedback on, that the article was helpful or things like that. Just people tweeting at you or telling you that it's helpful. That's also a good kind of rough measure of how effective an article's been. I think those are sort of the big ones, I think.
Thank you. So we have two more questions and we close it. I'll ask the next one and then Megha last one. So the current most upvoted question is, how do you get over the fear of self-promotion and bringing all this attention to yourself when you harbor doubts about your content?
That's a really great question. That's definitely one of the hardest things. But there's actually a simple answer to this, and the answer is you need to shift it from thinking about yourself and promoting yourself to helping other people. So think about it this way. Let's say you wrote the most helpful article on React in the universe, but if you didn't tell anybody, then it doesn't help anybody. So what you're trying to do with the self-promotion is really to help other people in the process. Now, the way you do that is really important, because if you just spam people with like, I wrote this article, then nobody's going to like you. But if you show up in places that people are asking questions about, you know, whatever your subject matter is, and you're answering questions, and then you put it in an article, then you're helping people. A great example for me was like, so I'm working on some AWS certifications, and in an effort to practice what I preach, I made an article called "Where to Start with AWS as a Developer," and it was just me. I just compiled all the resources that I had found in learning AWS and some of the big concepts that I was learning. And so that's really easy for me to share, right? Because it's just like, I legitimately made it to help other people, and it's not really about me. It's just sort of an article that I think other people would benefit from. So if you try to keep that in mind, of like making it less about you and promoting yourself, and more about just trying to connect people to resources that are helpful, then I think that helps a lot. And that's another thing that I think is really helpful about a platform like Hashnode, where it's very easy to kind of gain traction and get promoted and get views and stuff without having to do a whole lot of like link dumping and things like that, because you can just sort of comment on other people's articles, or, you know, engage with them in a way that is genuine and helpful.
Okay. Yeah, we have a lot of questions. So I would suggest all people whose question couldn't be taken up, you can simply post your questions on Twitter, tagging us and using the hashtag. And if, Sam can squeeze up a little bit of time, he can simply answer there. Or there are a few questions about the Hashnode itself. So we'll be more than happy to ask Catalin to, answer those questions. So yeah, one question that is a little repetitive. So we will like take one more, and I will try like this will cover a lot of them. So one thing most of people are asking is about republishing. So Sam, is it better to like post on different platforms, or it is good to stick with one?
So the key here is something called a canonical URL, and places like Hashnode let you do this. So you always want to publish on your own domain the original article. Now, whether you can, with something like Hashnode, you can connect it to your custom domain and it will still count. But publish the original article, that's called the canonical article, to your own domain. And then go, and any sort of community that you want to be involved with, then you can repost over there. And they should have a section called canonical URL that you can post the original article into. There's definitely pros and cons to, like, you don't want to do this in too many places because it becomes difficult to maintain it. So I would only do it a couple of places that you feel are key, like just a couple of different sites that you can do that. Like I post everything originally on my website, and then I cross-post it to Hashnode because I know that there's going to be good like traction there, and I like Hashnode and I like using it and that kind of thing. So some people also would do other platforms as well. So I would do that to the extent that you can maintain it and keep up with it. One thing that I've noticed, that I've proved out through experiments, though, is don't just post a like snippet of an article with a link back to the original article. People don't like that. It goes back to the like providing value on the platform that you're on. People don't leave a platform to go to another platform and read something. So post out the entire article in a different place and link back to the canonical article that way.
Thank you. So we will stop here with questions. Like Megan said, feel free to tag us on Twitter. The pressure is on you, Sam. I'll try to jump as well if I can, and if I have something to add. like I said, if you enjoyed this talk, feel free to follow Sam on Twitter because he shares a lot of nice content. I'm a big fan of his content, so you learn a lot. Let's thank Sam. Feel free to drop some emojis and thank yous in the chat. And that's all for today. I will see you on Wednesday, 7th of April, where Alice Spittle will talk about developer blogging and online presence. Thank you all for attending.
Yeah.
And thank you, Julien. Thank you a lot. It was awesome. And from my side, I learned a lot.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much,
everybody.
Sam.
Hope you have a great rest of your day.
I really had a great time, and I hope our participants too. So, about the task, we will like reiterate it on the Discord server once, so that like people can take a look on it again. But the whole talk was a really a, a good value bomb song, Sam. So
Great.
yeah, and with this, I would like really like to thank all the attendees who took out time to join us today. Along with, I would like to thank our Hashnode team. So we have a like pretty small but a really supportive team. So like everybody keeps us supporting throughout the way to host these sessions. And yeah, let's see you all in the next session.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.